I never thought my lawn would become the center of a neighborhood war, but that's exactly what happened when Deborah Wilkins, or as I've come to call her, Deborah the Dictator, moved in across the street. I'm Michael Townsend, a 42-year-old software engineer who works from home. I mind my business, pay my dues on time, and honestly just want to enjoy my modest 3-bedroom home in the Oakwood Hills subdivision without drama. When I purchased my home 5 years ago, I was excited about the large front yard, but after spending 2 summers battling the brutal Arizona heat, constantly watering, fertilizing, and still ending up with patches of dead grass, I decided to make a change. I researched extensively and invested in premium artificial turf, the high-end stuff that looks and even feels like real grass. It cost me nearly $15,000, but the water savings alone would eventually make up for it, not to mention the time I'd save on maintenance. The installation was professional and meticulous. The company even added subtle color variations and thatch layer to make it look completely natural. Unless you got down on your hands and knees to inspect it, you'd never know it wasn't real. For 3 peaceful years, my lawn looked immaculate through every season, while my neighbors struggled with their natural lawns during the scorching summer months. Then Deborah moved in. Within the first week, she introduced herself to everyone on the block by dropping off homemade muffins along with a sheet listing neighborhood improvement suggestions. Most people politely accepted her baked goods and promptly discarded her unsolicited advice. I wasn't home when she came by, so I missed the initial interaction, which, in retrospect, was probably a blessing. Our first encounter happened on a Saturday morning when I was checking my mail. She approached with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes, her blonde bob haircut bouncing with each determined step. She wore white capri pants and a pale blue polo shirt with the collar turned up, the unofficial uniform of HOA enforcers everywhere. "You must be Michael," she said, extending a manicured hand. "I'm Deborah Wilkins, your new neighbor from across the street. I've been meaning to catch you." I shook her hand. "Nice to meet you, Deborah. Welcome to the neighborhood." "Thank you," she replied, her eyes already drifting toward my lawn. "I've noticed your yard always looks perfect." The way she said perfect made it sound like an accusation. "Thanks," I said. "I try to keep it looking nice." She tilted her head. "What's your secret? Everyone else seems to have trouble with their lawns in this heat." I considered telling her about the artificial turf right then, but something in her tone made me hesitate. "Good irrigation and the right grass variety," I said instead, which wasn't technically a lie. I had 0 irrigation needs and the perfect variety manufactured in a factory. She nodded, clearly unconvinced. "Well, I've just been elected to the HOA board and we're working on updating some of the community standards. Your input would be valuable at the next meeting." That was my first warning sign. Anyone who gets themselves elected to an HOA board within weeks of moving in is someone looking for power. Still, I kept my expression neutral. "I'll try to make it if my schedule allows." She beamed. "Wonderful. I've taken it upon myself to really revitalize our community standards. There's so much potential here." I simply nodded and excused myself, having no idea that this brief interaction was just the opening salvo in what would become a suburban Cold War. The following week I skipped the HOA meeting due to a work deadline. Big mistake. 3 days later, I received an official letter from the Oakwood Hills Homeowners Association informing me that the board had passed several new lawn care standards that all residents were required to follow. These included mandatory seasonal fertilization, weekly mowing during growing season, and, this was the kicker, a prohibition against non-living ground covers exceeding 20% of visible lawn area. At the bottom of the letter was Deborah's looping signature alongside her new title, Chairperson of the Community Standards Committee. I immediately knew this rule was aimed specifically at me, even though she didn't yet realize my entire lawn was non-living. Rather than confronting her immediately, I decided to attend the next HOA meeting to understand what I was dealing with. The following month, I sat quietly in the back of our community center as Deborah dominated the proceedings. She had a slideshow presentation of neighborhood violations that included anonymous photos of offending properties. While my yard wasn't included, I noticed several of my neighbors shifting uncomfortably as their homes appeared on screen. And lastly, Deborah said with a triumphant smile, I am pleased to report that our new landscaping standards have been officially recorded with the county. Enforcement will begin next month, with inspection schedules to be determined by the committee. A neighbor raised his hand. What exactly are you looking for during these inspections? Deborah's smile widened. Oh, just compliance with our community standards, proper lawn care, appropriate seasonal plantings, and verification that all visible ground cover is primarily living material. We want Oakwood Hills to be known for its beautiful, natural landscaping. Her eyes flickered briefly in my direction, and I knew without a doubt that she suspected my lawn but couldn't prove it yet. I decided to wait and see how this would play out before revealing my hand. The first official lawn inspection occurred 2 weeks later. I watched from my home office window as Deborah and another board member walked the neighborhood with clipboards, pausing at each house to make notes and occasionally take photos. When they reached my property, they spent nearly twice as long as they had at any other house. Deborah even crouched down at one point to closely examine my grass from the sidewalk, though she didn't step onto my property. That afternoon, I received my first violation notice, citing suspicious lawn uniformity and demanding proof of my watering and fertilization schedule. The notice stated I had 14 days to provide documentation or face an initial fine of $100, with escalating penalties for continued non-compliance. I could have ended things right there by showing her the receipts for my artificial turf installation, which was actually permitted under the original HOA guidelines in place when I installed it, but something about Deborah's approach, the targeting, the assumption of authority, the sheer pettiness of it all, made me decide to play along for a bit. I responded to the violation notice with a vague letter stating that my lawn care regimen is proprietary and developed specifically for the Arizona climate, but that I could assure the board that my methods were environmentally responsible and compliant with all existing regulations in place at the time of implementation. I deliberately used corporate-sounding language to frustrate her. This initiated a bizarre back and forth. Deborah sent increasingly stern notices, each time adding new demands for specific information about my lawn care routine. I responded with increasingly vague and verbose letters that said essentially nothing, while promising compliance with relevant and legally binding regulations. Meanwhile, I started chatting with other neighbors and discovered that many of them were also receiving violation notices for minor or imagined infractions. Tom across the street was cited for having his garbage cans visible from the road for 3 hours, instead of the maximum 2 hours after collection. Maria, 2 doors down, received a warning about the color of her garden hose. It seemed Deborah was on a power trip, and I wasn't her only target. About a month into our passive-aggressive correspondence, things escalated dramatically. I arrived home from a grocery run to find Deborah and 2 men in my front yard. One was taking soil samples while the other was measuring the height of my grass with a ruler. Deborah stood supervising with her trusty clipboard. I parked in my driveway and approached them calmly. "Excuse me, but what exactly are you doing on my property?" Deborah turned, not at all embarrassed at being caught trespassing. "Oh, Michael, the Community Standards Committee is conducting a lawn analysis. It's within our rights according to Section 12.4 of the covenants." I crossed my arms. I don't recall any covenant allowing board members to enter private property without notice or permission. "We sent a notice last week," she said dismissively. "A notice of intent to inspect is not the same as permission to enter my property," I replied evenly. "I'm going to have to ask all of you to leave immediately." The 2 men looked uncomfortable, but Deborah stood her ground. "We have reasonable cause to believe you're in violation of community standards. Your lawn is suspiciously perfect. It never grows, never changes color with the seasons, and you're never seen mowing or watering." "My lawn care methods are my business, as long as the results comply with regulations," I said. "We believe you've installed artificial turf across your entire front yard," she announced triumphantly, as though accusing me of hiding a toxic waste dump, "which is a direct violation of our new standards." I remained calm. "Please leave my property now, or I'll be forced to call the police to report trespassing." The two men immediately started packing up their equipment, clearly wanting no part of this confrontation. Deborah's face flushed red. "This isn't over, Michael," she said as she finally turned to leave. "The HOA has methods of enforcement you won't like." "Have a nice day, Deborah," I called after her, which only made her walk faster. That evening I received an emergency violation notice with a fine of $500 for obstruction of HOA duties and confirmed suspicion of unauthorized ground covering. The notice gave me 7 days to remove all artificial turf and replace it with approved living grass varieties, or face additional penalties of $200 per day. Now it was time to fight back properly. I contacted a lawyer who specialized in homeowners association disputes. After reviewing my case, including the original HOA guidelines that were in place when I installed the turf, which contained no prohibition against artificial grass, and the documentation showing my installation predated Deborah's new rules by 3 years, he assured me I was on solid legal ground. They can't retroactively enforce new rules against improvements that were compliant when installed, he explained. That's called grandfathering, and it's a basic principle in property law. Plus, they conducted an unauthorized entry onto your property, which violates state trespassing laws. Armed with this knowledge, I drafted a formal response letter. Rather than sending it directly to Deborah, I addressed it to the entire HOA board and the management company that oversaw our community, making sure to copy all homeowners via the neighborhood email list. In the letter, I detailed the timeline of my lawn installation, with attached receipts and permits, cited the relevant sections of the original HOA guidelines that contain no prohibition against artificial turf, and explained the legal principle of grandfathering. I also included a section about the unauthorized property entry and a statement from my lawyer indicating we were prepared to pursue legal action if necessary. The response was immediate and dramatic. My email inbox filled with messages from neighbors sharing their own stories of Deborah's overzealous enforcement. It turned out she had been systematically targeting nearly everyone in the neighborhood with nitpicky violations, using the threat of fines to enforce her personal vision of what our community should look like. The next day, I received a call from Gerald Thompson, the HOA president, requesting a private meeting. We met at a local coffee shop where he seemed genuinely apologetic. "I want to personally apologize for this situation," he said after we'd gotten our drinks. "Deborah has been overly enthusiastic in her role. Several board members have expressed concerns about her approach, but she's been very persuasive in meetings." "I understand enthusiasm," I replied, "but trespassing and targeting specific homeowners goes beyond enthusiasm." Gerald nodded. "You're absolutely right. The board is calling an emergency session tonight to address these issues. In the meantime, please disregard any violations or fines you've received. They're all on hold pending review." I appreciated Gerald's approach but made it clear that a simple apology wouldn't be sufficient. The new rules need to be reconsidered, particularly those that attempt to retroactively prohibit already approved improvements. "I agree completely," he said. "And between you and me, several other board members feel the same way." Deborah pushed these changes through during a meeting with minimal attendance. That evening, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Deborah standing there, minus her usual clipboard but with the same determined expression. "Michael, I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot," she said without preamble. "I'm simply trying to maintain property values and community standards. Surely you can understand that." "I understand wanting a nice neighborhood," I replied. "What I don't understand is trespassing on private property and targeting specific homeowners with rules created specifically to penalize them." She waved her hand dismissively. "That's a bit dramatic, don't you think? Nobody is being targeted. The rules apply to everyone equally." "Deborah, let's be honest. You created a rule against artificial turf after suspecting I had it, then immediately tried to enforce it against me despite the fact that my installation predated your rule by 3 years." Her smile tightened. "The timing is coincidental. Artificial grass looks tacky and unnatural. It's bad for the environment and—" I cut her off. "Actually, in Arizona, artificial turf conserves thousands of gallons of water annually per household. My installation is permeable, allowing water to reach the soil beneath, and the materials are eco-friendly and recyclable. As for appearing tacky, you didn't even realize it was artificial until you became suspicious because it looked too good. She shifted uncomfortably. Well, regardless, the community standards cannot be retroactively enforced, I finished for her. It's called grandfathering, and it's a basic legal principle. My installation was compliant when it was put in, and you know it. Her expression hardened. The HOA has broad enforcement powers. We'll see what happens at tonight's emergency board meeting. Yes, we will, I agreed. Have a good evening, Deborah. She turned and walked stiffly back to her house. I closed my door, already anticipating how the meeting would go, based on my conversation with Gerald. The emergency board meeting that night was apparently quite dramatic, according to the neighbors who attended. Deborah arrived with a thick binder of evidence against various homeowners, only to find herself faced with a room full of angry neighbors armed with copies of my email. When the board president opened the floor for community comments, person after person stood up to share stories of Deborah's overreach and harassment. The meeting concluded with 3 significant outcomes. First, all pending violations issued in the past 3 months were nullified. Second, the new landscaping rules were suspended pending a complete review and community vote. Third, and most satisfyingly, a motion was passed requiring all HOA board members to complete a training course on proper governance procedures and homeowner rights before issuing any further violations. Deborah, I heard, sat stonily through the entire meeting, interrupting frequently until the board president had to remind her about proper meeting protocol. When the vote to require board training passed nearly unanimously, she dramatically collected her materials and stormed out of the meeting. The next morning I was enjoying my coffee and the view of my perfectly artificial lawn when a moving truck pulled up in front of Deborah's house. I watched with surprise as professional movers began loading furniture. Later that day, Gerald stopped by to fill me in on what had happened. Deborah resigned from the board last night, he explained. She sent an email claiming our community doesn't appreciate proper standards and that she's moving to a more exclusive neighborhood with residents who understand the importance of property values. I couldn't help but laugh. All this over some fake grass she couldn't even identify until she got suspicious. Gerald shook his head, smiling. The irony is that after your email, several homeowners have asked for information about your artificial turf installation. With water prices going up, people are interested in alternatives. And that's how my perfect artificial lawn not only survived Deborah's crusade, but became a neighborhood trend. Within 6 months, 5 other homes on our street had installed similar turf, all with proper HOA approval under revised guidelines that now specifically permitted water-conserving landscaping alternatives, including high-quality artificial grass. The new board even asked me to lead a sustainable landscaping committee to develop environmentally friendly standards that would maintain property values while reducing water usage and maintenance needs. Our community has since won a regional award for water conservation efforts, and our story was featured in a local newspaper as an example of how homeowners associations can adapt to support environmental sustainability. As for Deborah, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she moved to a community with even stricter HOA rules, where she's already at odds with her new neighbors over the height of her garden gnomes. Some people never learn. But every time I look at my perfect, evergreen, maintenance-free lawn, I silently thank her for inadvertently bringing our community together and sparking a positive change. Sometimes the grass is greener on the other side, especially when it's high-quality artificial turf that drives away power-hungry neighbors.